There is a great debate in the Christian community about whether Christians should entertain the fantasy genre. Is fantasy inherently evil? Is it something Christians should stay away from? Or does it have redeeming or even godly qualities? Let's talk about the roots of fantasy first. Fantasy does have its roots in things like fairy tales and mythology, but the transformation of the fantasy genre to the version that we know now, most notably epic fantasy, is all thanks to J.R. Tolkien, a Christian. Almost everyone has at least heard of The Lord of the Rings, whether you've seen the movies or read the books. You probably have heard the name. And rightfully so. The Lord of the Rings defined the epic fantasy genres. And today's fantasy authors, whether they realize it or not, have Tolkien to thank. Tolkien used his books to share messages and promote values that line up with biblical principles. His work didn't need to be allegorical to the Bible for it to be something that Christians could read. Tolkien actually hated allegorical stories, and he never intended to write with a Christian lens. He was far more inspired by mythology, but due to Tolkien's Christian beliefs, just by nature of him being a Christian writer, those beliefs make it into his stories. Things like evil in all its forms will ultimately corrupt and destroy itself. On the other hand, Tolkien's close friend C.S. Lewis did write allegorical books. Most people have also heard of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was written by C.S. Lewis. This book allows children to engage with the story of Jesus in a whole new way, and generations have loved the Chronicles of Narnia series. They've even attempted to make movies twice about it. They never finished the series, though. And aside from writing this early fantasy series, Lewis is also known for creating plenty of adult Christian literature. So this leads us to our next point, that fantasy can be one of the best ways to get God's messages across, even if they're not allegorical. If you've seen my video on messages and themes, I go really into depth there. But fantasy can bring to light issues in the world in a entertaining and dramatic way. Many fantasy stories, whether strictly Christian or not, promote biblical values like peace, good versus evil, selflessness, perseverance, honor, and bravery. Fantasy also removes the real world issues from a situation. We can examine things like war and its ramifications without dragging in real world groups of people. Issues like prejudice and classism can also be highlighted in a new and exciting way. All of this helps build empathy in the reader while also entertaining them. Check out my video about messages and themes for a more in-depth talk about it. Of course, the big debate in the Christian community is the occult and whether fantasy promotes it. The Bible shows clearly that God is against occult practices, so this is a very valid concern. And it's something that's even given me pause. There was a point in my life when God pointed out all of the things that I needed to purge and how to fix my unhealthy relationship with writing. And during this time, writing in the fantasy genre was a subject that I brought to him. I've loved fantasy for a long time, but I was willing to give it up if it was a genre that led people away from him. Fortunately, this isn't the case, necessarily. The fantasy genre has many great qualities. However, there is that line that needs to be drawn, and we're going to talk about that. So where to draw the line? This is my personal conviction. However, I think this is probably just a good baseline rule for Christians to follow. If your convictions are stronger than that, we'll talk about that some more. But yeah, always listen to your convictions. There are two major factors in a fantasy story that let me decide if it's a fantasy story I should consume. And this also applies for my writing. The first is to look for messages and content. And this goes for any genre in entertainment. This one can be frustrating because unless you know about the author and the kind of content they're going to be putting in their books, you either have to look up what the messages in a story are, getting a lot of spoilers, or you might be surprised in the middle of reading and be like, ooh, that's not a message I want to promote. For example, a common plot point that I see a lot in modern fantasy stories are that the god of the world is evil or doesn't care about people's like disinterested. It's a very common trope that I've been seeing. And this isn't a message that Christians should be promoting because people do equate, whether they realize it or not, God in fiction with the real God. I go in more in depth on that in my messages and themes video. Another common trope I'm seeing is a lot of morally gray characters that do not grow out of being morally gray. It's almost celebrated and promoted throughout the story. They don't change and people love it. But as Christians, we can't promote morally gray values. If you have a morally gray character in a story who learns that being morally gray is actually not good, that's a different thing than it being okay in the narrative. And of course, we can't forget the rampant, spicy material that are in a lot of books right now. So I'm not gonna lie, combing through books and trying to find fun, well-written fantasy stories that don't contain any of that, just those three, has been very frustrating. Now, number two, when deciding if a fantasy story is one that I can support, is actually going to be the magic system. How's the magic system set up? This one maybe is a bit more nuanced, but hear me out. Magic systems that reflect real world occult practices are no go. Now, this can look like summoning, rituals, spells, divining, tarot, etc. If these are present in a story and wielded by the villain, it's fine. But if the protagonists are using them to save the day, then it's something we should be staying away from because we don't want to glamorize the cult, even if it's in a fantasy world. We also don't want to promote stories with dark forces or forbidden magics that the protagonist characters participate in without consequence. If a protagonist character taps into dark forces or forbidden magics and it comes back to bite them and that's different because it's condemned by the narrative, we just don't want the narrative to be like, yeah, that's cool, that's how we're going to save the day. So what does that leave us with when it comes to magic systems in fantasy worlds? Natural biological systems. There are plenty of ways to make the magic system inherent or biologically wired to the characters. Allomancy in the Mistborn series is a good example of that. Some people are born with this power, some people aren't. It's not something that they're conjuring up. It's not something that they are having to do rituals to get. They don't have to make deals with a mysterious entity, complete a ritual, or perform any real world occult practices to use the power. When we talk about the magic system being biologically based, it's okay because that's how the world was designed. So if in your fantasy story that is how things were designed, it's fine. Because ultimately, sin is going against how God designed the world, and real life occult practices does go against how God wants us to interact with the world. But in a fantasy story, you can make it where that's just an inherent part of how the world was supposed to work. One last trait that I would be cautious about when you're engaging with science fiction or fantasy is transhumanism. Are the stories making being human in some way terrible? There's a certain whiplash and dissatisfaction these stories promote within the reader when they're done with the material. We don't want readers to put down a book and then look around their life hating it. So what's wonderful about like the Lord of the Rings is that the hero of the story, while he's not a human, he's a hobbit, he's one of the weakest beings in Middle Earth. He doesn't have special abilities and he's smaller than humans. Yet he gets to be the hero. And this encourages the reader to see themselves as capable too. The feeling would be different if they only read about powerful, eternal beings saving the day. Now, I'm not saying you can't have those stories or make those stories, but give humans a chance in your stories. Now, let's really talk about proceeding with discernment. So, of course, always follow your convictions and use discernment when choosing or what content to let yourself consume or your kids. If you're wrestling with whether something is okay or not, choose to leave it. If God tells you to be more strict than my guidelines, then do so. God is more privy to your situation, your shortcomings, and your future than I am. So if he tells you not to engage with a certain kind of material, then don't. The compromise isn't worth it. So following your convictions might be something that's really important for you, or it might be important for someone close to you. If you see a kid or even yourself becoming super obsessed with something, then it's time to disengage from that material. We have to have a healthy balance with our fiction. We tote fandoms today like they're good things, and they can be in moderation, but they should never be an all consuming obsession. So if you find yourself or your kids forfeiting reality for fiction, it's time to disengage for a while. You want to make sure that life stays balanced between fantasy and reality. And this is coming from someone who used to have an unhealthy relationship with fiction. But in summary, fantasy is an extremely popular genre with no signs of slowing down. It can be a vehicle for uplifting messages and biblical principles, even without drawing allegories, but it can also be used to promote occult practices and dissatisfaction with life. Just like with all entertainment, we need to be discerning in what we consume. And as writers who are also Christians, we have an even heavier responsibility to ensure that we're leading people is a little closer to God and not further away. And stories, whether we want them to or not, have the power to do so. And if you like my content, please help a small creator out, like and subscribe, or leave a nice comment.